Hello NFL football fans and fantasy football owners. Welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. As always, I'm your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout Lance Goodman, getting fantasy football owners fully prepared for their live drafts, which are fast approaching, with the NFL season kicking off in a little bit over 2 weeks from now. Let's go ahead and dip into part 2 of our segment today. We are looking at the top wide receiver prospects for this year's upcoming fantasy football draft. If you didn't see the video on the top tier guys, I expect to go 1 through 11. Make sure to check that video out. We're going to jump into the next set of guys that I expect to be taken behind those guys. In no particular set order, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns still has a lot of tread left in the tire. If Deshaun Watson can get back to form, and that's what we expect for him. The guy was paid over $200 million. We've seen Joe Flacco coming off the street last year and be able to feed Amari Cooper properly. We expect for Amari Cooper to come out and have another impactful year for fantasy football owners. Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts, the clear uncut #1 option for that Colts offense when it comes to the passing game, had a breakout season last year, got paid in the offseason, so you know Indianapolis is going to make it their business to get him the football. How about Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints? Was up over 85 catches last year, up over 1,100 yards. The only thing we didn't see was him get in the end zone enough. If he can push his touchdown totals up to that 8 to 10 TD plus range, he's a guy who's going to yield excellent value for your fantasy team this year. Let's talk about Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, working opposite Tyreek Hill. It's going to be real interesting to see if Miami can fit him into the offense on a more consistent basis. I feel like there's more than enough room for him to eat next to Tyreek Hill, but will the arrival of Odell Beckham Jr. potentially cut into his target share? Because we know that Tyreek Hill is definitely going to eat. You also have to keep into consideration they picked up tight end Jonnu Smith, and Miami likes to utilize the short passing game. And so Jalen Waddle, one of those guys, seems to struggle with consistency. He either has a big game or is kind of quiet. So that's something that has fantasy football owners a bit on the fence. But when you look at that Miami offense and consider his individual talent, he's certainly a guy, by all means, that you're going to want to have on your fantasy football team if you can get him at the right place and the right time. I think a guy who has an opportunity to really see his numbers take a big jump this year, it's going to be T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. Has struggled with injuries quite a bit in the past. Also, Tyler Boyd, the third wheel, who had been in that Cincinnati passing game along with Jamar Chase for the past couple of years, is now gone to the Tennessee Titans. And so T. Higgins, the clear, uncut, #2 option, 1A next to Jamar Chase. I expect for his target share to take an increase. We know that T. Higgins is a baller. If he can stay on the football field, I think this could be a career year for him. He's also looking for a new contract, so that also is something that always motivates players to step their game up. Let's move on to Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Was the top receiver taken off the board this year. Has an excellent quarterback in Kyler Murray. When you have the talent and skill set that Marvin Harrison Jr. has, and you're going to be the unquestioned #1 target on that team, I find it hard to believe that this guy is not going to come out and have a stellar rookie season. You look at Malik Nabers, who was also taken in the top 10 by the New York Jets. The big contrast and difference between those two guys is going to be quarterback play. Daniel Jones for the New York Giants, returning from an ACL injury. Never was a great quarterback to begin with, but you'd have to think with head coach Brian Daboll being an offensive-minded guy, he'll find some different ways to get Malik Nabers the football. Nabers has had nothing but great things said about him coming out of Giants training camp. And when you spend a top 10 pick on a player, he's expected to come in and pay immediate dividends again. In the bigger scheme of things, when it comes to fantasy football, we're talking about volume. There's no question if Malik Nabers can get a legitimate 8 to 12 quality targets each week, he'll definitely be a guy that you can put on your fantasy team and trust on most weeks. Let's move on to that wide receiver tandem out in San Francisco when we talk about Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Both of those guys, big parts of that San Francisco juggernaut offense. Both of those guys are going to get a ton of targets. The problem is, very rare do you see those guys have big games on the same week, unless Deebo Samuel is more effective on the ground. which 49ers look to use him in the running game and around the goal line. When you look at Brandon Ayuk's huge numbers last year, a big part of that was Deebo Samuel being hurt for extended periods of time. And so it'll be interesting to see if Ayuk is able to repeat those numbers. But again, one of those two guys, without question, you're going to want to have on your fantasy team. And if you had to choose one ahead of the other, I think that Brandon Ayuk will be the way to go, considering Deebo Samuel's long-running injury history. Let's move on to DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. As an individual talent, it's all still there. The quarterback play of Geno Smith is going to be very important. Last year, Geno Smith's numbers were way down. Sam Howell is now in Seattle, pretty much pushing Geno Smith for that starting spot. Geno Smith got paid a nice bag last year, so Seattle wants to see him succeed. But if he gets off to a slow start or struggles with injury, don't be surprised to see Sam Howell get in there. Either way it goes, DK Metcalf is a guy that you want to get the football to early and often. I still think he's a big enough of a playmaker that in the right round, you're going to want him on your fantasy football team. And then how about a couple guys who are coming in at the number 2 receiver spot? I'm talking about Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. When you look at that Raiders offense next to Devonta Adams at wide receiver, Jacoby Myers is the unquestioned number 2 wide receiver, gets a lot of targets, is used inside of the red zone. I think he's a guy, if you had him on your fantasy football team last year, especially if you made the playoffs late in the season, this was a guy who paid off in a major way. And I think for where you can draft him at, he's a guy that you're definitely going to want on your football team. Let's talk about Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears. No longer with the Los Angeles Chargers. We know that DJ Moore is the alpha in the pecking order when it comes to that Chicago Bears passing game. But new rookie quarterback Caleb Williams is ultimately going to determine who he wants to target the most. Even though Keenan Allen is up in age, definitely still one of the top route runners and skill possession wide receivers in the NFL. I think the big question is, how much is he going to be sharing targets with rookie Rome Odunze, who the Chicago Bears spent a top 10 draft pick on in this year's draft. And so between those two guys, it'll be interesting to see how those targets are split up. But you know how it is in fantasy football. You're going to want one of the two on your team because injuries do happen. And by default, that'll give one of those guys a huge bump in what's expected to be a very exciting and high-flying Chicago Bears offense this year. And then rounding out our list is going to be Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. Was a great find for that Kansas City offense last year as a rookie. I'm pretty sure him and Patrick Mahomes put the work in the offseason. And that's the key word. When you have a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes, you have a head coach like Andy Reid, those minds collide, and they should continue to put Rashee Rice in position to be successful and be a major player for your fantasy football team. That's going to round out our segment. Make sure to hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram to leave your comments on what players you like, your feelings, your thoughts, and opinions. We're going to run to a quick break. When we come back, it'll be more of the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show here on NFLExporter.com.